When we first talked about this subject several months ago on the phone, it sounded a lot better at the time than when we started putting this together, because it is very challenging. The one thing I'm going to preface, there is a huge lack of data to go off of to probably go back and answer that exact feed cost on that marginal value in terms of the perfect group versus our normal group. And so my approach is, with that in mind, is to still use that concept, but then dig into the different aspects nutritionally and some other management factors that we do in barn to really talk about where some of the costs and how we, from a nutrition standpoint, how we can help manage variation. Because I get a lot of questions. I know there's obviously the veterinary community, you get the questions in terms of what we can do nutrition. Is there additives, added fat, all the different things. And at the end of the day, there's things we can do, but what's the cost of them? And then what are the things that we could do that are free in terms of potentially that management that we can interlay nutrition on when I'm going to get to sorting and split sex feeding and some of those things. And so what my goal is to try and tie nutrition in with some of the management practices we do and look at the different costs and values that can potentially come in. It's interesting right now, we have one of our PhD students, Chad Polk. He's spending his dissertation on variation and modeling and different things. And the statisticians, he works very heavily with those. We have a tremendous set of ag statisticians at Kansas State. And they basically come back and sometimes they say, you're nuts. Why are you wanting to reduce a population variation? Because then you lose your ability for that selection of the best individuals to set us out. And then you can get rid of the ones that aren't doing as well. And that's a good point. So what's the question? The question is generally, at least from a nutrition standpoint, it's about reducing variation, but oftentimes we want to get rid of that lower tier of pigs, right? Those are the ones that cost us money. Now we have the fastest growing ones that can blow over the grid, all right, and we get docked for those. But generally the conversations are questions, what can we do to increase the growth rate of the group? And it's really a change then of the distribution. It's not necessarily tightening it, it's how we get them to go faster. And what's the cost of that? But then I also want to come back and we're going to talk about how do we narrow that up with some different management practices. So I guess the bottom line question I hope to get through, and again, appreciating comments as we go along or questions you have, is how do we decrease that variation and ultimately improve net revenue? How do we potentially maximize getting pigs over the top, minimize that group on the bottom that certainly is the economic hole that we often run into when we look at that group net revenue. So what do I want to go over? I'm going to talk a little bit and first spend some time on diet energy. What's happened with diet energy? If we go historically, are diets today higher or lower energy than 5 to 10 years ago? Lower, right? Somebody said lower. The cost of calories, the cost of feed cost of fat, even with high-priced corn, okay? Oftentimes, when I'm going to get in, move it down. Am I too loud? I'm sorry. All right. There we go. Yeah. Enthusiastic. K-State actually won a football game last night, so I'm still on a high. So, all right, that's good. Actually, it's going to be the wet noodle contest. I told my friends I came up here because there's a Vikings game today. I'm not going to be going to that. They play the Chiefs here in 2 weeks, and actually my whole family from South Dakota is coming down for some reason because my dad's a Vikings fan. So it's going to be the battle of the wet noodles, I think, when the Chiefs and Vikings play, two of the worst teams. But as we look at average daily gain to reduce body weight CV, added energy, all right? As we've historically fed added fat, what pigs in the barn, if we're delivering feed, every pig is getting that, right? But in fact, not all those pigs need that added energy. But that's how we feed pigs. It's back to how we set up our systems, how we manage them. And we're going to have some data I'm going to show. The fastest gaining pigs in the barn will not benefit from that added fat. It's the lightest groups we're going to have the biggest impact from. But how do we manage that? We deliver feed to that whole group. And so I want to talk about, again, challenging some of the things that we do there. The paline use can be addressed in a separate talk. I think back to the feeder type on average daily gain for increasing the growth rate of the entire group. Again, I'm going to intermix that some, but I think that's a valid conversation in terms of improving gain, improving the weight of that to minimize, because we're on days. Right now in the industry, it's very hard to find barns. We're tight on days. We got to get them out the door. How do we get that bottom group up? Okay? And with the right marketing strategies, we can prevent those top pigs from costing us money on the top side. Interesting how with all of our different ingredients, and I swore I'd never use the word alternatives anymore, and somehow I crept that in. I guess it's just indoctrinated in my head. We don't have alternatives anymore. Distillers is part of our diets. It's no longer, I broke my cardinal rule of using it as an alternative. It's just part of our diets. Wheat mids in different places, bakery. Yes, they are alternatives to corn and soy meal, but the reality is today they're staples. Okay? And so how do some of those, and in fact there's some unique data, there's some data I'm going to show that actually some of these alternatives, and whether it's more in fiber, there's a big lack of data, whether we feed lower energy diets higher in fiber, if that in fact does increase our variation. There's some data that may say that that actually does. I want to talk a little bit about sorting, and then I want to not forget the obvious. We can hammer for 45 minutes here on nutrition. We can spend a lot of money nutritionally to try and do this. But at the end of the day, there's a couple things that it makes nutrition somewhat irrelevant. And David already talked about weaning weight, but going back to Roger Main's weaning age data, all of us recognize the value of an older pig in terms of growth rate and whatnot. I want to review the data of the variation at market weight and see the impact of that. And so we'll hit on a few different topics. So again, as I already reiterated, oftentimes we talk about increasing the entire growth rate of the group. If we take, and this is a hypothetical bell curve, but again, it's moving with a 10% CV percent, simply just making the whole group grow faster. All right? How can we do that? One of the only ways, well, there's different ways to do it. The most typical way historically has been giving more energy. If we give more energy in a commercial grow-finish diet, pigs will oftentimes, in most situations, grow faster. Okay? So let's talk about adding fat. So let's just review this concept quick. Because I think as we've thought about fat historically, either we thought its price is in, we get to summer, we got to feed fat in summer is oftentimes what I hear. So let's talk about adding fat here a little bit. Average daily gain improvement, oftentimes a 1% improvement for every 1% added fat. Okay? But what's important to recognize, and again, there's data sets that we could find that contradict this, but if you, at least the about 15 commercial trials we've worked with combining the data, and we'll have a little calculator I'll show you here in a few minutes. 2% improvement in the grower period, no improvement in late finishing with the added fat. And that has to do with the lean gain of an animal, its needs for energy at those points, versus later finishing when it starts to plateau off, its feed intake catches up. Now again, we could find data sets and there's different philosophies. This will be the philosophy I'm going to carry at least with this talk. Okay? Feed efficiency, pretty classic, 2% improvement for every 1% added. So again, this is a hypothetical curve. Okay? But what I want to point out here is, can we accomplish, if we take our normal distribution curve, all right, you'll see in this particular slide, the higher energy is going to be the higher peak, but we're not changing this top side. What the goal of what I'm going to talk about in the next few slides is, can we take the slowest gaining group and move them up? Okay? And then, in fact, have a tighter group to market. So it's not pushing the whole group, it's pushing that bottom group. And then how can we potentially accomplish that? Okay? We did several studies. Chad Hastad, who's currently at New Fashion, their nutritionist, was with us at K-State and worked on his degrees. And part of some of the work he did was at our New Horizon site in Minnesota, was looking at how we do added fat regimens for different classifications of pig weights and how they'll respond in terms of growth, and as we look at final variation of that group at the end. So that's what I want to talk about with Chad's work. Again, we broke these pigs, we weighed them all. These studies, there's not a lot of data sets on these. The reason is you go in and individually weigh a lot of pigs a lot of times. And in fact, so this is a case where we basically went in and weighed the entire barn, broke them into light, medium, and heavy pigs, and there's their starting initial weights. And then factorialize that with added choice white grease either at 0 or 6%. Okay? This first slide is just set up to show that we got the typical fat effect, average daily gain if we combine all the pigs. had an improvement in average daily gain, and then we had our improvement in feed efficiency. So again, 6% added fat. When we combine all the pigs, we certainly get a nice response, as we would suspect. So again, setting up the fact that added energy is going to improve growth, improve feed conversion. So what did it do for the individual pigs, or for the individual classifications? There was no statistical interaction, which basically indicates that based on their weight and added fat level, statistically, okay, so that's where I get in trouble, the university professor up here, if it's not statistical, it didn't happen, right? Okay? But I think we need to dig in that data a little bit more just due to some of the variation that we saw in our means. If we took the heavy pigs, compared no fat to fat, there's about a 4-pound advantage. We went to the light pigs, about 7.5 pounds, and the mixed was 5.3, basically right at the average. So what this data would show, that in fact, while not a statistical interaction to pull that out, the lightest group of pigs actually gained more than the heaviest pigs when fed added fat. I think that's kind of an interesting information as we look at what pigs in a population benefit more from these different dietary regimens. In fact, then, about a 3.5. Now, obviously, we never caught, never got up. But I guess this leads into the question, and I'll get to this more. If we can, I mean, our barns are not set up. Most barns are not with individual feed bins on individual sides. We generally have the same feed line running all the way through. There is barns set up that way. And this goes back, and I'll get into some of the sorting data here in a little bit, and so trying to intermix and get you thinking about that. Well, what if, back to the what if scenario, if we want a tighter window and if we have the days in terms of these fastest gaining pigs going to hit our target on time, why don't we look at heavy pigs on one side, light on the other? Feeding non-fat diets potentially, because oftentimes right now fat is not economical. I believe on my next slide I'll show that even in the prices at $2.05, fat was not economical for the lightest pigs. So they had ended at $2.67. We feed added fat to the light pigs, and then we pull that. We go and basically pull about 10 pounds difference between those populations versus 17 going blue to blue in terms of not having them fed fat. Basically, because most diets are non-fat right now. So instead of that 17-pound difference, did we tighten it up and have a 10-pound difference in that population at the end? Okay, a lot of what-ifs in that. I guess there's different ways to look at that data. I just want to pull that out as part of the discussion for today. So as we ran economics on that data set, fat was not economical in terms of margin over feed cost. The light pigs was certainly economical, and the average group was not. And in fact, if we look at today, average group is not for feeding high-level added fat all the way through. And so again, as we break out the weight gain differences that we saw, and this is driven off of that extra weight gain that we saw from those lighter pigs, we got that extra revenue. And so again, and that does, and also this comes into play as the extra, these pigs get marketed at Swift out of our New Horizons group. So again, discounts, premiums, whatnot, all get brought in as part of that. We in fact did okay. Again, there's different ways to measure, and again, I want to talk about added fat to tie this in. There's different ways that added fat economics is valued, and there's different companies and everybody, different ways, calculators out there. This is the one that we have used. And if we look currently, or when I made these slides about a month or so ago, I took some prices at that time of our corn, soybean meal, fat, grind mix delivery, 90-cent carcass price. And if we can see the increase in feed cost per pig at 2.5 or 5% fat, it is not without significant cost that added fat comes into the diet. That's always been the case. But even today, as we look at bringing fat into the diet. And at that same point, if we break it by phase, finisher 1, finisher 2, and so on all the way down, our model would show that added fat would have benefits in the early, barely, and certainly not as we have it in from 150 pounds on. And that's dollars lost per phase by that pig. So again, as we look at the cost of energy, okay, moving the growth rate, we're not feeding nearly as much fat as we used to, okay? And so how do we then try and do that? In fact, as we've gotten into wheat mids, we're getting our distillers and a lot more fats being spun off. Historically up to this point, most of our distiller grains has a very similar energy to corn, maybe a little higher, maybe a little lower. As we start spinning this fat off with a number of our ethanol plants, it's going to go down. And so then where are we at in terms of energy with that? So again, things to be thinking about in that regard. Also, before I leave this, I think it's important as we look at the growth rates back to variation and hitting the targets that that's kind of why we're here. When is fat generally fed? If you're going to feed fat, when's it normally go into the diet? Summer. Why in summer? Heat, growth rate goes down. Pigs that are marketed, using this data and most philosophies that pigs would gain faster from having added fat early versus late. Pigs marketed in July get placed in what month? March, April? Going in that time frame? So when should the added fat be really in the diet? When they're placed. Remember, added fat's going to give the benefit earlier in that growing pig's life. Oftentimes we think about, it's hot, we're going to dump fat in summer. And it will help when we limit the feed intakes go down. We do have the added benefit of fat, and that's why we put it in. But if our goal is to maximize weight of our summer marketed pigs, that are generally is our highest net revenue time, it's thinking back to March and April, in May. It isn't when it just got 110. It's back when those pigs were growing good, and then we can get them to enhance their weight because it's too late for summer marketing, okay, to really get that benefit of weight. The same philosophy is a 50-pound pig that's placed in July. When's it marketed? November? Okay. What are we going to start here? We went through a summer where weights were considerably off. What are we going to start hearing in 1 month from those that are marketing and the packing side in terms of weights? Blowing over, right? Because what happens every fall, September, October, November, most systems, not everybody, most systems growth rate takes off, pigs are getting over, we can't get pigs out the door fast enough. Okay? Why were we feeding those pigs fat back in July when we may be taking heavyweight discounts for them in November? Okay? So it's back to our systems. David, I think set that up about how we're set up, how we're thinking about it. We need to be thinking, it's back to Stephen Covey, with the end in mind. When are those pigs going to market? Okay? How can we reduce variation? Why are we feeding a 50-pound pig fat in July when it's marketed in November? When we don't need that added growth oftentimes. Okay? It's thinking about when we're going to market, how we tighten that to reduce the variation in how we manage that. Okay? So back to CV, and again, I know I'm intermixing final barn weights and CV, but that's the reality that we live in with some of this. As we look at, and I'm going to come back because I'm going to include some of this data. I had that slide in twice, and I elected to keep it in and just talk about it when we get to some of this sorting. But basically, when we look at Chad Hastad's data, fat does not influence variation within or across the population in terms of the light, medium, and heavies. From the standpoint is if we add fat, I guess the question is if I add fat, does CV improve within a group of pigs? Within the lights, mediums, or heavies? And it doesn't. We can influence the population CV if we fed it fat to the lights, didn't feed it to the heavies. There's ways we can manipulate that to tighten it up. But fat itself doesn't influence CV within a population in terms of that group's growth. And again, we've already talked about feeding this light group and how we can potentially manage that. All right, sorting. And the reason I want to talk about sorting, even though that's not directly nutritional, is that sorting plays a big role in maybe how we need to evolve our nutrition into feeding pigs in these barns. And so again, as we look at, again, there's much, much less sorting done today than historically, but there is some systems that still very heavily sort pigs into the nursery. Not only just pulling the smallest 10-15%, but still sorting lights, mediums, and heavies. There's some of that still goes on in finishing side. And I think most people have moved and understand the fact that we shouldn't do that from most of the data out there from a growth rate standpoint. The one thing about sorting, the reason it was done, I grew up in South Dakota on a hog farm, and I remember as clear as bell, Dad, when we would wean groups of pigs, they would go lights, mediums, and heavies, and it made us feel good, right? It makes you feel good. You got them all in there. You think you got the variation taken care of because you got them all in their individual groups. And within that pen, you're right. Within that pen, the variation isn't there when you start. But did you change the population variation? No. There's still the lights and the heavies and the weight distribution. But in our minds, we got them sorted, and boy, they look nice and uniform when you go in. Well, if about all that does is give us a warm, fuzzy feeling. It doesn't do anything necessarily for the pigs. And in fact, we'll have data to support that it actually causes us more problems in terms of final body CV and give up growth rate. Okay? Here's some unpublished data from a commercial. This was done on a commercial site, over 1,000 pigs in this particular study in a commercial nursery. And what they did was they went in and visually, this was done visually, so I'm not going to be able to have individual CV data, but basically visually sorted the pigs, lights, mediums, and heavy, then took a cut of those lights, medium, and heavies and put them in a mixed for an unsorted type situation. And there was two different stocking densities, and basically, I guess what the take-home is, if we look at the lights in the red, blue, and yellow, as we'd expect, the lightest pigs were still the lightest at the end, mediums, heavies were still the heaviest at the end of this nursery cycle. But interestingly, the unsorted pigs, if you look at the average, and this red line should stop here, this is the average of those three, they were about 3 pounds heavier when we did an unsort versus sorted by weight category. Okay? And if you think about just variation, you put it like animals together, the same bio, the social orders have to be reestablished. It's all about the animal welfare, social order type things in terms of you put like animals, like weights together, just like you put the entire offensive line together and throw them in the buffet line versus you kind of put the kicker in there with. The kicker kind of knows his spot. He knows not to get in front of the tackle, right? So again, all about some of that social order. Regardless of stocking density, we saw that. Okay, so two different kind of interactions going on there. And so that's why, again, moving the whole bell curve, all right, we can move them to a heavier weight. Some data done at K-State, and this was in one of our finishers, and I'd preface this, and again, a lot of times in university research, and many of you are involved with that, what do we generally do? If we have a group of 300 pigs, and we got spaces for 250 pigs in the finishing barn, what 50 pigs don't get on test? Is it a gate cut? No. What do we normally do? Kick out the runts, kick out the heavies, and we got the middle, right? Okay? So I want to preface this. This was already probably a little bit biased group going in terms of getting rid of the monsters, getting rid of the lights to have as uniform a group as possible. Oftentimes that happens in our research settings, but I just want to preface that. I don't think it changes the interpretation of the data much, but I guess just want to make sure you're aware of that. Again, and here's a finishing, medium, or heavy weights, medium weights, light weights, as we'd expect when we would sort them by weight, weigh them individually at the beginning. The big pigs are still the biggest at the end. That isn't anything new. But look at the unsorted. Again, average-wise, which is a combination of all three of these, they had the same average daily gain as the heavies. And in fact, if we look at final body weight then, because remember, these unsorted had to start at a lower body weight because it had the lights and mediums in. But if we look from a gain basis, they did the same. And if we take the average of these three groups, they weighed 260.5. Again, about a 4-pound difference. Okay? So again, we talk back to nutritionally, how are we going to do this? Can we feed? Is it best to sort or unsort? We certainly don't recommend sorting pigs into barns, except in the nursery. We need to pull off that smallest group for extra feed budgeting and care. But in terms of moving that bell curve, nutritionally, how can we potentially tie in some of that? Okay. This is the CV of those same pigs of equins. Again, about 10 years ago we did this data, but again, you look at the standard deviations, very narrow for the heavies, mediums, and lights, but there was differences. Oftentimes, and this is what we see in our general populations, the CV of our lightest group of pigs, or the standard deviation, either one, is bigger than that of the mediums and heavies. And that's generally because we have more of a tail. We can end up with a bigger distribution of some of those lighter pigs that can kind of bias us down. But irregardless, look at where we started. And of course, the unsorted was a wider standard deviation because it's a combination. But then as we went through at the end of finishing, there was no differences. And in fact, we were, as a percent-wise, the pigs that were sorted got worse than that started unsorted. Again, back to that social order. And I'm not an animal behaviorist or a pig social person, but again, back to that. We broke that social order. There was more aggression, more competition, whatever it was, whatever the reasons were. And in fact, at the end, even though at the beginning, within group, we did a nice job in our mind of having a nice uniform group. At the end, you couldn't have went back in there and picked out which the lights, mediums, and heavies in any sort of accuracy at the end. I guess that's what my point is. Okay? They reshuffled, had a bigger distribution. Okay? Back to the Chad Hastad data where we talked about added fat for the different heavy, lights, and mixed. The CV within each population didn't change. Now there was a difference between lights, medium, and heavy in terms of the CV, and that's where this statistical for sort comes in. But in terms of no interaction, nor was there the effect of adding, whether it's adding fat or differences between. And so, again, as we look at sorting, we potentially can influence it initially, but in the end, we're not going to make a big difference. Interestingly, on the O'Quinn data, I just showed there was that 4-pound difference at the end of finishing between the different sorting groups and unsorted. Okay? Here's a contradiction to that, though. In this data, there was no difference when we compare at the end the lights and medium, the heavies and lights. They averaged 161.7, mixed 161.7. Okay? So, is it clear cut? Probably not. Does sorting hurt us? Probably it may or may not. But again, there'd be data support that we get improved growth rates by not sorting. Here's data that said they were the same. So again, as we talk about all that, how do we intermix and how do we make decisions on that? So again, from a body weight variation standpoint, O'Quinn reported that actually as a percentage-wise, as we look at from where they started within that subgroup to where they end, it actually increased. Chad's data would show that there was no impact of sorting on final body weight CV. Okay. Doing all right on time. I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about our different ingredients. Just a single slide I'm going to throw up on distiller grains. This is data from Mark Whitney, part of his dissertation, now an extension specialist here in Minnesota on the swine side. And interestingly enough, one of his finishing trials, and again, there's not been a lot of data reported with various ingredients on body weight CV. If we look at a control 10, 20, or 30% distillers, you'll see there's a statistical and about a 4-point increase in CV when pigs were fed up to higher levels of distillers. Why? Again, back to we don't know why. Maybe, and again, there's very little data reported, so my message is certainly not distillers is increasing variation, because I don't think that based on one data set we can draw that conclusion by any stretch. But the way it makes us think about it as we dig into the higher fiber, it's a need to know. There's very little data as I comb through trying to find when we get into fiber levels, lower energy diets. I've talked about added fat, but where are we going? We're going the other way, right? We're actually saying how low energy diet can I feed and still make this system flow and work. Okay? So again, something for us to be thinking about in terms of where we do have needs, and I would say this is certainly one. This, again, a single data set, but it certainly showed some potential variation. And this goes back to, there's been different places at Kansas State, at North Carolina State. We've done preference work with distillers. You put in 4 different feeders, move them around, make the pigs try and seek out different diets, and they'll generally always try, statistically, no problem find the corn soy over a diet that has distillers. But that isn't to say when you force them to eat, they eat it fine, because a lot of finishing diets today, what's the finishing levels of distillers today? 30, The minimum, a lot of 40s, quite a few 50s, depending on your packer. Okay, so again, we're getting by really good on closeouts at some of those levels. So hard to say how much a problem there is or not. And so why are we using alternatives? And I'm using the example of distillers in this case. Used current prices are fairly close to when I put this together about a month ago. Bottom line, 30% distiller saves about $8 a pig. 40%, just over 10. We went to 50%, you'd save another $2. Okay? Wheat mids in some places, certainly we can have an impact. Bakery, hominy, we start going through the different alternatives based on region. So what do we need to know about some of these ingredients compared to a corn-soy diet? I would say we know very little in terms of some of the variation they may or may not cause. I don't think, so again, just more something, part of the discussion as we go forward. Something else I'd like to talk about is, again, back to the growth rate and back to system constraints. And when we put in equipment, how does that potentially impact the growth rate, the CV, marketings, what diets we can feed, diet strategies as an example, to, from a nutrition standpoint, in these particular groups of pigs. One of the things that we found, and again, I think for going back historically, I think people have recognized the value of wet-dry feeders. That's why a number of them go in. But we set up and tested. These were all trials done at our New Horizon system, so at 1,200 head barn. John Bergstrom finished his PhD, now works with DSM as a swine nutritionist. And you'll see in every case we had a positive effect. And generally, a wet-dry feeder versus a conventional feeder is what we compared to here. Those pigs were generally 12 pounds heavier at the end of finishing than from a conventional dry feeder. 12 pounds, take the average of those, we'll get pretty darn close to that. Okay? They simply gained more, they ate more. But feed conversion, no differences, negative, negative. Positive, no difference, no difference, no difference, negative. Okay, so generally we have a little worsening. In most cases, even these no differences numerically would be slightly off. Lean, because they're eating more, almost all negative. Okay, they're fatter. And income over feed is certainly the mix. But this is fed to the entire population. Okay. Charge of today's talk is how do we manage and look at within our different populations, how are we going to do that? Back to added fat. Do we have one side of the barn we're feeding fat to and one that we're not? Question is, and something we've really hypothesized is within a barn, if you fill that barn, do you have wet-dry feeders on one side and conventional on the other? 12-pound difference. Okay, your fastest growing pigs are going to if you don't get them out and back to marketing and how systems are set up, a number do just complete dumps. Do you top once? Do you top twice? I mean, again, back to all the different ways of doing it. We can improve growth rate of a population by just the feeder type. Okay, how fast can we pay for those feeders potentially by getting that bottom group up 12 pounds in the same amount of days? Okay, back to nutrition, back to management. How do we do that to potentially help us out in that regard? Okay. Ties into split gender feeding. This has been one of the bigger challenges, and it's interesting. Many systems have kept it. Many systems have said, "The heck with it." Or if they've went wean to finish, the goal has been to get that barn filled as quick as possible. And so, because if we don't fill that barn as quick as possible, oftentimes a barn string over 10, 14 days, if not longer, and we're trying to feed budget those little pigs. Oftentimes we can handle the pellets. Pellets oftentimes we get in, we get feeders full, whatnot. It's normally that second diet that really causes problems in feed budgeting. If the feed budget's 12 pounds for that group, the first pigs in the door generally get about 18 to 20, and the last ones in get 5 to 6. Okay? Do the calculation on a lot of that. And then, what were the last pigs in the door? They're the lighter ones. They're the younger ones. And now we just shorted them a nursery budget, back to weaning weights, back to variation. What do we just do nutritionally that's going to cause more variation within that barn? Okay? Back to the fact, if you can't get that barn full within a week, feed budget-wise, it's going to cost us more, and just go ahead and not even split sex at that point. Just fill the barn faster. Okay? But if you're filling the barn, it's back to light pigs versus heavy pigs. Is this a situation where it's old pigs versus light pigs? You still got to dump that barn at the same time approximately. Instead of filling from the back of the barn going across the aisle, fill one side first, fill the other side second. If you have different feed lines going in, you can still set your feed budgets up accordingly. And so again, then in that small group, is it wet, dry feeders? You know, a lot of different combinations come in here to improve that growth. We can do different nutritional things. Again, challenging, how do we practically tie all that together, though? That's the question. If it was easy, we'd all been doing it a long time ago. How do we practically make it work? With the high feed costs we're in today, I think we're under new pressures to try and figure out within our systems how we practically do that. Again, weights for barrows and gilts, about 11 pound. You know, it varies. 11 pound difference in the end most generally. How do we go ahead and tighten that up? Again, the gilts, back to the lights and heavies, and practically how do we try and tighten that window up in terms of making them more closely the same size at the end to prevent a lot of those lightweight gilts from getting a discount when we got to close that barn out. Okay? All right. Back to with the end in mind. We can hammer nutritionally certainly can have an impact. All right? But if we don't set ourselves up with the right type of pigs, back to the 40% being genetics that David pointed out. Well, what else? The Roger Main, when he did the data with weaning age, and a lot of the industry looked and adopted some of those measurements based on growth rate, mortality, survivability. But one of the things that probably didn't get a lot of publicity, what I want to bring out, and it's relevant for this talk, is look at the CV at 42 days post-weaning or 156 days post-weaning for 12, 15, 18, and 21 days of weaning age. Okay? Just this alone, and again, if we're in that 18 to 21 day, you know, we can, again, less of a dramatic from the lightest pigs. And we always get questions, well, what about, I'm at 23 days, what about that? Well, I wish I knew the answer. I'm not sure if it's linear. We start to really plateau off. But again, setting ourselves up with the right pigs, otherwise health, nutrition, all the things that are going to be talked about this morning. You know, we're trying to put Band-Aids over for some of these things on piglet quality, whether it's birth weight or especially here in the case of weaning weight. All right? It can certainly have a big influence. And to put that in a graph, we like the bell shape back to visuals. Well, I can tell this purple bar, again, we had to put that in purple just to be the K-State winners, right? Okay? So purple, 21 day, look at that tight bell-shaped curve compared to the others. And especially, again, back to these 15 to 18 days, so we start pulling out the younger pigs to fill a weaning group, okay? Where does that bar end up, okay? So again, back to how we tie it together with nutrition and management, those are things that become very important. Okay. So, do we look at average daily gain to improve or not worsen group CV? How do we do that? Energy can certainly have an impact. We also could feed if again, we're not spaced long, but the reality is if we split a barn, we could feed the heaviest pigs a lower energy diet. Do we dilute that with wheat mids? Most people, we're going to get the growth rate, but there's things that can be done depending on space situations. Feeder type, sorting, dietary ingredients, okay, mixed gender, all those things, and certainly the older pigs. So as we look at costs, and again, I wish I could have thrown up the exact marginal cost, and basically there's not data out there to do that. We could come up with hypotheticals, but for every hypothetical there's 10 different ways that every system does it. I guess what my goal was to present different mechanisms nutritionally that we could potentially look at. And then it's a lot on an individual system basis. Does that work for me or not? I want to show what's possible, and then let's work within systems to see what we can actually get done or not. There's some references from the data that I've shown here. K-State, like other places, there's a lot of different calculators. The fat analysis calculator that I showed on there, the distillers, and there's a lot of other information to be used around this particular area.